What if the delay isn't a problem at all? What if it's just the echo of an assumption you never changed? Beloved, the moment you feel it done, the world has no choice but to follow. At the center of this teaching stands the uncompromising instruction of Neville Goddard: begin at the end. Not as a poetic suggestion, not as a motivational idea, but as a law of consciousness. Neville was precise. He did not say work toward the end, visualize the end occasionally, or hope for the end. He said begin there, occupy it, assume it. The end is not a reward that comes later. It is the creative position from which all later appearances must flow. When this is misunderstood, manifestation becomes exhausting. When it is understood, effort collapses naturally. Neville often described the world as an echo, and this analogy is far more exact than it first appears. An echo does not decide what to repeat, it simply answers what was already sounded. The valley does not negotiate, delay, or reinterpret the voice shouted into it. It reflects it faithfully, according to its nature. In the same way, the outer world does not originate experience, it answers consciousness. What you encounter is not the cause, but the response. This means the question is never what is happening out there, but what state is being occupied within. The echo must follow the sound, and it cannot do otherwise. This brings us to a critical clarification. The end is not a future event. It is not a date, a transaction, a person arriving, or a condition finally changing. The end is a state of being. It is an inner position where the desire is no longer wanted, discussed, or anticipated, because it is quietly assumed. When you are hungry, you desire food. When you have eaten, hunger ends. Not because the meal is exciting, but because it is complete. Fulfillment does not announce itself with fireworks. It settles in as normalcy. To live in the end is to live from this inner normal, where the desire has already exhausted itself. This understanding was also echoed by Florence Scovel Shinn, who emphasized living in expectancy rather than effort. Expectancy is not waiting. It is a calm knowing that something is already arranged. Effort strains toward an outcome, while expectancy rests in alignment with it. One feels heavy and urgent, the other light and assured. When expectancy replaces effort, anxiety loses its function, because anxiety only exists where outcomes feel uncertain. Certainty dissolves it without argument. Here is the promise that reshapes everything. Once the end is occupied, the means are compelled. You do not have to design the path, manage the sequence, or supervise the unfolding. The moment the state is assumed as done, life reorganizes to confirm it. This is not because the world is generous, but because it is obedient. Consciousness sets the pattern, and experience conforms. When the end is truly taken as your dwelling place, reality has no alternative but to rearrange itself accordingly. Desire ends where fulfillment begins. There is a subtle misunderstanding hidden inside the word desire itself, because desire is usually treated as evidence of absence rather than as an announcement of direction. When something is desired, the mind often interprets that desire as proof that fulfillment is missing, distant, or conditional. Yet desire does not arise to torment you. It arises to reveal a movement of identity. It is a summons, not a sentence. Desire points to where consciousness is ready to stand, not to what it must chase. The discomfort people associate with desire does not come from wanting, but from refusing to step into what the desire is already indicating. Consider how a destination functions. A destination only matters while you are not there. The moment you arrive, it stops being a goal and becomes your location. You do not keep staring at the address, planning the route, or reminding yourself where you are supposed to be. You simply live there. In the same way, desire only has intensity, while fulfillment is imagined as separate. Once fulfillment is assumed, desire dissolves naturally, not through suppression, but through completion. The wanting ends because the being has begun. This is why fulfillment does not feel dramatic. It feels settled. The mind expects fireworks because it associates achievement with effort and struggle, but consciousness does not operate on theatrics. It operates on states. When you move into the state implied by the desire has no further function. It has done its work. This is often misread as loss of motivation, when in truth, it is the quiet confidence of arrival. You are no longer leaning forward into the future. You are standing where the future was pointing. If arrival is the goal, then effort must be redefined. Effort, as most people understand it, is activity performed to bridge a gap. But when the gap is closed internally, effort changes its nature. It becomes expression rather than striving. Actions may still occur, decisions may still be made, but they are no longer fueled by lack. They arise from alignment. This is why the same outer behavior can feel exhausting in one state and effortless in another. The difference is not the action itself, but the position of consciousness from which it flows. Desire, then, is not asking you to work harder. It is asking you to move, not physically but inwardly. It is inviting you to relocate from the identity of the one who wants to the identity of the one who has. When this shift occurs, something profound happens. The mind stops negotiating with the future. It no longer asks when or how, because those questions only exist for someone who is not yet there. Fulfillment begins precisely where desire ends, and desire ends the moment you allow yourself to arrive. Effort is rarely questioned because it has been culturally praised. Yet within the logic of assumption, effort carries a quiet confession. To exert effort toward an outcome is to imply that the outcome is not yet secured. The strain itself becomes a message, and that message is read by consciousness before it is ever read by the world. Effort says, "This is not mine yet, and something must be done to make it so." When this inner statement is repeated, even subtly, it stabilizes the very distance it is trying to close. Imagine knocking on a door you claim already belongs to you. The act of knocking contradicts the claim of ownership. If the house were truly yours, you would not announce yourself from the outside or wait for permission to enter. You would walk in naturally, without hesitation or ceremony. In the same way, effort functions like knocking. It is an outward gesture that denies inward possession. No matter how disciplined or persistent it appears, it reinforces the identity of the outsider. This does not mean that movement, action, or participation in life must stop. What changes is the source from which they arise. There is a difference between action that flows from assumption and action that attempts to produce assumption. The first feels light, almost incidental, while the second feels heavy and urgent. Strain appears when the mind believes it must convince reality, rather than recognize that reality is already responding to an inner position. The more one strains, the more one confirms that the end has not yet been entered. This is where the confusion between persistence and effort becomes clear. Persistence is often mistaken for repetition, forcing the same inner statement again and again in the hope that volume will replace certainty. But repetition without acceptance is still resistance. It is not the number of times a thought is stated that gives it power, but the degree to which it is believed as natural. Effort tries to overpower doubt, while assumption quietly outgrows it. When effort is dropped, it is not replaced with passivity, but with ownership. Ownership has no urgency. It does not rush, plead, or monitor results. It rests in the knowing that what is assumed must externalize in its own way and time. The moment this shift occurs, the inner argument ends. Consciousness no longer stands outside the end, trying to reach it. It stands within it, and from that position, everything that follows feels inevitable rather than earned. If the end is assumed and not chased, stay here. Subscribe and let these ideas become familiar instead of forgotten. Persistence means remaining, not repeating. Persistence is often misunderstood because it is framed as an act of doing rather than a condition of being. When people hear the word persistence, they imagine effort sustained over time, a kind of mental endurance where one must constantly repeat affirmations, visualizations, or inner statements to keep something alive. Yet, true persistence has nothing to do with repetition. It has everything to do with residence. It is not about how often a state is visited, but whether it has become the place from which you live. You do not rehearse your name in order to remember who you are. You answer to it because it is already assumed as yours. There is no strain involved, no mental discipline required to maintain that identity. It is simply recognized as natural. In the same way, an assumed state does not need to be constantly asserted. Once it is accepted, it functions automatically. The mind stops checking it, defending it, or proving it, because it no longer feels optional. Remaining in a state means allowing it to feel ordinary. This is where many lose their footing, because the mind expects transformation to feel intense. When intensity fades, it is misread as failure, when in fact, it is evidence of success. The feeling of naturalness is not a loss of power, It is the confirmation that the state has been integrated. What once felt imagined now feels familiar, and familiarity is the signature of assumption. Repetition is often used as a substitute for belief. When belief is weak, the mind tries to compensate by saying more, visualizing harder, or focusing longer. But no amount of repetition can replace acceptance. A state is not stabilized by force, it is stabilized by agreement. The moment consciousness agrees with an idea as true, it stops arguing with it. That inner silence is persistence in its purest form. This is why persistence becomes effortless when the state feels like home. You are not holding it in place, you are simply not leaving it. Thoughts may still arise, circumstances may still present contrast, but they no longer have the power to dislodge you. You remain, not because you are trying to, but because there is nowhere else you would rather stand. In this remaining, the state continues to express itself outwardly, without supervision, without pressure, and without delay, dictated by doubt. The feeling of the wish fulfilled is not excitement. One of the most persistent misunderstandings around fulfillment is the belief that it must feel exhilarating, intense, or emotionally elevated. The mind has been conditioned to associate success with peaks, rushes, and dramatic inner shifts. So when those sensations fade, doubt quietly enters. Yet fulfillment was never designed to feel like excitement. Excitement belongs to anticipation, to the moment before something is secured. It is the emotional energy of not yet having. When the wish is fulfilled inwardly, the emotional charge settles, not because something has gone wrong, but because something has completed itself. Naturalness is the true confirmation of assumption. What feels natural does not demand attention. It does not need to be celebrated, rehearsed, or protected. It simply is. Think of gravity. It does not thrill you, impress you, or announce itself, yet it supports you constantly. You do not wake up amazed that you are still held to the ground. Its reliability is precisely why it fades into the background of awareness. In the same way, when a state is truly assumed, it stops demanding emotional validation. It supports experience quietly, consistently, and without display. Many abandon the end at this stage because they mistake calm for indifference. They believe they must keep the feeling alive through intensity, when in fact intensity would indicate that the state has not yet been fully accepted. The fulfilled state does not need emotional maintenance. It carries its own stability. When the mind stops trying to feel something and simply allows itself to be something, the inner atmosphere changes from effort to ease. This understanding reframes what it means to let go. Letting go does not mean forgetting the desire or pushing it away. It means releasing the need to feel something dramatic in order to trust that the inner act has been completed. The fulfilled state does not vibrate loudly. It rests. It does not call attention to itself. It blends into identity. When this is recognized, anxiety loses its foothold, because anxiety feeds on the belief that something is still unresolved. The quietness of fulfillment is not emptiness, it is saturation. It is the feeling of something being so accepted that it no longer needs to announce itself. When the wish fulfilled feels ordinary, when it no longer produces emotional spikes, that is not the moment to interfere. That is the moment when the inner work has reached its conclusion, and consciousness is ready to allow the outer world to echo what has already been settled within. Letting go is dropping doubt, not the end. Letting go is one of the most misunderstood ideas in this entire teaching, because it is often interpreted as abandonment rather than completion. People assume that to let go means to stop caring, stop imagining, or stop holding the desire in awareness. But letting go has nothing to do with releasing the end itself. It has everything to do with releasing the inner tension that questions whether the end is secure. What is released is not the assumption, but the anxiety surrounding it. The idea of Sabbath, as described in this philosophy, is not inactivity in the outer sense. It is inner cessation. It is the moment when consciousness stops revisiting the question of whether something will happen and rests in the knowing that it already has in essence. This rest is not forced. It arrives naturally when the inner act feels finished. Just as the body rests after nourishment, the mind rests after assumption is complete. Rest is the sign of trust fulfilled, not discipline applied. The farmer does not plant a seed and then dig it up every day to check its progress. Doing so would not demonstrate care, it would reveal doubt. True care is expressed through confidence in the process already set in motion. In the same way, repeatedly checking, adjusting, or worrying over an assumed state does not accelerate its expression. It interferes with it by reintroducing uncertainty. The moment consciousness begins to monitor results, it silently repositions itself outside the end. Rest appears only when the inner act is complete. This is why forced detachment never works. If the assumption has not been accepted as final, attempting to let go will feel like suppression. But when the assumption is natural, letting go happens on its own. The mind simply stops returning to the subject, not because it is avoiding it, but because there is nothing left to resolve. The question has already been answered internally. This is the quiet shift from effort to faith, though faith here is not belief in something unseen, but confidence in something assumed. It is the absence of inner argument. Thoughts may still pass, circumstances may still present movement, but the core position remains undisturbed. In this state, consciousness no longer interferes with its own creation. It allows life to perform the rearrangement it is already compelled to carry out. Letting go, then, is not a technique. It is a consequence. It is what naturally follows when doubt has exhausted itself and the end has been inwardly secured. Nothing is being released except the need to supervise, question, or hurry the outcome. The end remains firmly in place, assumed, stable, and complete, while the mind finally rests in the certainty that what is planted does not need to be watched in order to grow. There are moments when the assumed state feels steady and natural, and moments when it seems to waver under the pressure of appearances. These fluctuations are not signs of failure. They are simply indicators of attention shifting. What creates instability is not circumstance itself, but the temporary forgetting of where consciousness has chosen to stand. When attention drifts outward and begins negotiating with conditions, the inner position loosens. The solution is never forced correction or emotional struggle. It is always a return. The end functions as an anchor. An anchor does not fight the movement of water, nor does it attempt to control the wind. It simply holds position. In the same way, the assumed end does not argue with contradiction. It does not need to explain itself to appearances or prove its legitimacy through results. It remains what it is. The moment attention returns to this inner anchor, stability is restored without effort. The wobble ends not because circumstances change instantly, but because consciousness stops being pulled by them. A compass does not argue with storms. It does not panic when visibility is low or conditions are rough. It continues to indicate true north, silently and reliably. The end operates in the same manner. When outer conditions feel confusing, delayed, or contradictory, the role of the end is not to fix them, but to orient you. It provides direction, not drama. The more familiar this orientation becomes, the less power temporary appearances have to disturb inner certainty. What often prolongs a wobble is the attempt to correct it through intensity. When doubt arises, the instinct is to think harder, feel more, or reaffirm with urgency. But urgency only signals that consciousness has momentarily stepped outside the end and is trying to get back through effort. Returning to the end is simpler than that. It is not an act of will, but an act of remembrance. It is the quiet recognition of what has already been assumed as true. Each return strengthens the relationship with the state, not because something new is being added, but because familiarity deepens. So over time, the end becomes the default position rather than a destination that must be revisited. Contradictions may still appear, but they no longer provoke reaction. They are seen as movement within the echo, not evidence against the sound that produced it. In this way, returning to the end solves every wobble, not by controlling experience, but by stabilizing the only place from which experience can ever change. Once the end is assumed as a living reality, rather than a hoped-for outcome, life begins to move with a quiet precision that often goes unnoticed at first. This movement is not dramatic, nor does it announce itself as progress. It appears ordinary, sometimes even inconvenient, yet it carries an unmistakable direction. Neville referred to this movement as the bridge of incidents, not to suggest a single event or turning point, but a sequence of unfoldings that must occur in order for the assumed state to express itself fully. The bridge is not something you step onto consciously, it is something you find yourself already walking across. What makes this concept difficult for the mind is its impersonality. The bridge does not consult preference, comfort, or logic. It is assembled according to necessity alone. Once the destination is fixed inwardly, the route recalculates automatically. This recalculation often disrupts expectations because the mind tends to imagine a direct and pleasant path. Instead, the bridge frequently appears as ordinary days, unexpected conversations, subtle changes in mood, shifts in interest, or circumstances that seem unrelated to the desire itself. Yet each element is positioned with exactness, even when its purpose is not immediately visible. The obsession with how arises from a belief that consciousness must supervise creation in order for it to work. This belief keeps attention anchored in effort rather than assumption. When the mind tries to manage the bridge, it steps outside the end and re-enters anticipation. It begins to evaluate whether things are moving fast enough, whether the right signs are appearing, or whether something has gone wrong. But the bridge does not respond to monitoring. It responds only to occupancy. The more settled the end feels inwardly, the more fluidly the bridge assembles outwardly. Timing, too, becomes a source of misunderstanding. The mind interprets delay as resistance, when in fact timing is governed by coherence, not impatience. Events unfold at the pace required to align all necessary elements, both seen and unseen. This alignment cannot be rushed without destabilizing the structure itself. When the end is truly lived in, questions of timing lose urgency, because time belongs to the journey, not the destination. The destination, assumed as present, no longer waits. What is often overlooked is that the bridge does not exist to reward belief. It exists to fulfill assumption. Belief can fluctuate, moods can change, and emotions can rise and fall. Yet the bridge continues assembling as long as the end remains the dominant inner position. Even doubt, when it arises, does not dismantle the bridge unless it succeeds in relocating consciousness entirely back into the state of not having. The bridge is resilient because it is built on identity, not emotion. Seen from within the process, the bridge rarely makes sense. Only when the end has fully expressed itself does the sequence become clear in retrospect. Events that once felt random reveal themselves as essential links. Detours show themselves to be precise redirections. What once appeared as delay is understood as preparation. This retrospective clarity is not proof that the bridge worked. It is proof that it was never arbitrary. The bridge of incidents assembles itself because it has no alternative. Once the end is assumed, life must rearrange to reflect it. Not because life is cooperative, but because it is responsive. The moment the destination becomes an inner fact, movement becomes inevitable. Nothing needs to be forced, corrected, or accelerated. The bridge is already forming, quietly and continuously, carrying consciousness toward what it has already decided to be. There is a point where understanding must give way to habitation, where a concept stops being something you visit mentally and becomes the place from which you live. This is the role of the state akin to sleep. SATS is not a technique layered on top of effort, nor is it a ritual meant to impress the subconscious through repetition. It is a threshold state, where the boundary between imagination and identity softens, allowing the assumed end to settle in without resistance. In this state, the mind is no longer arguing, correcting, or evaluating. It is receptive, but more importantly, it is intimate with what it accepts as real. A house becomes home not because of how often you visit it, but because you stop treating it as temporary. At first, a house feels unfamiliar. You notice every sound, every corner, every imperfection. Over time, familiarity replaces alertness. You no longer think about where things are. You simply know. SATS functions in the same way. At first, the end may feel imagined, almost foreign, but when entered consistently in this softened state, it begins to lose its strangeness. It stops feeling like a scene you are creating and starts feeling like a place you return to naturally. What makes SATS unique is not the imagery, but the quality of awareness present within it. The body is relaxed, the analytical mind is subdued, and the sense of effort recedes. In this condition, imagination is no longer used to convince, it is used to occupy. The end is not projected forward, it is experienced as now. This immediacy is what allows the assumption to bypass resistance. The mind is not asked to believe something new, it is allowed to recognize something familiar. This is where many misunderstand the purpose of SATs. It is not about intensity or vividness. It is about dwelling. A scene does not need to be elaborate to be effective. It only needs to imply fulfillment and be entered with the feeling of normalcy. When the end is experienced in SATs as something already established, it stops being an exercise and becomes a reference point. The nervous system adjusts to it. Identity reorganizes around it. The state begins to feel lived in rather than imagined. As this familiarity deepens, a subtle shift occurs. The end no longer requires deliberate entry. It begins to appear spontaneously in thought, mood, and expectation. This is the sign that the state is becoming home. You are no longer visiting it in SATs alone. You are carrying it into waking awareness. The inner atmosphere changes. Reactions soften. Anticipation fades. The end is no longer something you return to. It is something you return from. This leads to the final realization. Creation is finished. Not in the sense that nothing else can happen, but in the sense that the inner act has been completed. SATs is where the assumption is sealed, not through force, but through acceptance. Once sealed, it does not need reinforcement. It expresses itself naturally through the bridge already assembling. SATs is not where you make things happen. It is where you stop preventing them. When the end becomes home, consciousness no longer wanders in search of fulfillment. It rests where fulfillment already is. From that rest, life moves, responds, and arranges itself accordingly, carrying into form what has already been lived in imagination. Return to the end until it feels like you. Everything in this teaching resolves itself into a single uncompromising truth. The end is the only creative act, not the effort to reach it, not the techniques used to approach it, and not the hope that it will one day arrive, but the assumption of it as already done. This was the final instruction of Neville Goddard, and it was never meant to be softened or negotiated. The end is not something you visit occasionally in imagination. It is the position from which life is meant to be lived. When this is understood, creation stops feeling like a process and begins to feel like a decision already made. Persistence, seen from this perspective, is no longer labor. It is loyalty. Loyalty to an identity that has been inwardly accepted. There is no strain in loyalty, because it does not require constant reinforcement. You do not wake up each day reaffirming who you are in order to remain yourself. You simply continue. In the same way, persistence in assumption is the quiet refusal to relocate back into the old state. It is not repetition for reassurance, but remaining because the new state feels more accurate than the old one ever did. Life reorganizes itself around the state that is habitually lived in. This insight was articulated clearly by James Allen, who observed that circumstances are not random visitors, but faithful servants of inner conditions. What surrounds you is not an independent force acting upon you. It is an echo responding to what has been consistently assumed. When the inner state changes, the outer arrangement must follow, not out of kindness, but out of law. The echo cannot refuse the sound. Urgency dissolves when this is truly grasped. Urgency exists only when the end is still treated as future. When the end is assumed as present, there is nothing to rush toward. Time loses its emotional charge because it no longer stands between you and fulfillment. The echo must follow the sound, and no amount of anxiety can accelerate an echo. It arrives precisely when it must, and never before the sound has been fully given. This is why the return to the end is the only movement that ever matters. When doubt arises, when appearances contradict, when impatience whispers that nothing is happening, the solution is never to fix the world. It is to return inwardly to the position where fulfillment is already established. Each return deepens familiarity. Each familiarity strengthens identity. Over time, the end stops feeling like an assumption and starts feeling like recognition. Tonight and every night, there exists a quiet threshold where this recognition can be entered effortlessly. In that softened state, the end can be felt not as excitement but as completion. When it is felt as done, there is nothing left to manage. Rest follows naturally, not as a technique, but as a consequence. The inner act concludes, and life is released to perform its part. When the end is assumed, the world has no choice but to agree. It may take its own route, speak its own language, and move through sequences you would not have designed, but it will agree. It always does. Because reality does not argue with consciousness. It reflects it. And once the end feels like you, reflection becomes inevitable. Stay rooted in the end. Subscribe here.